In 1824, nearly 50 years after he first set foot on American shores, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States of America. In 1777, Lafayette had been a wealthy, idealistic youth who volunteered his services to the Continental Army, only to become deeply enamored with the values of the American Revolution, to believe in what Thomas Paine proclaimed in Common Sense, that the cause of America was in great measure the cause of all mankind. But by the 1820s, that revolutionary generation was passing into memory. Lafayette himself had grown old. He could no longer ride a horse. He walked with the use of a cane. He found himself mired in debt, and yet he longed to see the progress of the nation he helped to found, a nation whose work he knew remained unfinished. And so, in the summer of 1824, Lafayette returned to his adopted home one last time before he bid his last adieu. Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Ambuske, and welcome to Revolutions in Retrospect, a podcast from Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media that explores the histories of the revolutions that remade the Atlantic world. From the civil wars of 17th century Britain, the Jacobite uprisings, and American independence, to revolutionary Haiti, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, and everything in between. On today's episode, I'm joined by historian Brian L. Cole, author of the new book, The Last Adieu. Lafayette's triumphant return, the echoes of revolution, and the gratitude of the Republic. Ryan, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. I'm overjoyed to be with you again, and I'm sorry it took so long for us to get together again.
Well, it was worth the wait for this book, The Last Adieu, about Marquis de Lafayette's triumphant return to the United States in 1824. And I think we're going to have a good conversation today as we're thinking about the upcoming 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and that was surely on Lafayette's mind in that period. But first, I thought you are actually in a place right now where you're coming to us from. You're kind of surrounded by the American Revolution and the early Republic. Where are you right now?
The factual answer is I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, not far from the campus of Indiana University. But to be a little more poetic and to bring my location in relation to our subject, I'm in Monroe County, Indiana, which is to the south of Morgan County, Indiana, which itself is to the south of Marion County, Indiana. If you keep going north, you'll get in Hamilton County. To my west is Greene County. To my east, a couple counties over, is Fayette County. So the founders and the heroes of the Republic, or heroes of the Revolution, were on the mind of the settlers of this part of the country.
Oh, for sure. And we're talking a lot about the memory of the Revolution today with Lafayette's return. Before we really get into that, though, I thought it would be useful to remind folks when Lafayette first came to the United States, back during the days of the American Revolution. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought him to North America in the late 1770s?
Yeah, it depends on which Lafayette authority you consult, but I think we can agree on a combination of a search for martial glory and a desire to avenge the death of his father at the hands of the British, Battle of Minden. And of course, most importantly, I think, is a love for the ideology of the revolution. Now, there's some debate. I think the foremost Lafayette scholar, Louis Gottschalk, wrote that it wasn't until after he came to America that he really began to embrace American values. It doesn't really matter. But he came here, I like to say, and this is one of the reasons why, he has many fans still today. He came here to fight for the freedom of people he didn't know, the land he had never seen, and he did so. Not only did he risk his own life, but he spent his own fortune to do so. And it's important to remember, as a French soldier and nobleman, incredible understanding even at a young age of optics, as we would call them, and gestures. So this young nobleman joining the rebel cause, an incredible symbolism which he knew, paid his own way, bought his own ship to come to America. So I like to, my friend Al Zambone, who maybe you know, has his own podcast, right? We talked the other day, and he said something that I'm going to give him credit. He said, and then once he got here, he grew magnificently into the role of Major General and kind of bookend that with being shot at Brandywine. And remember, he had no actual battlefield experience, right? And then at the other end, the strategic game of cat and mouse, trapping Cornwallis, the Chesapeake Bay, and leading to the successful siege of Yorktown and eventually American independence. But I should say, I think beyond the military accomplishments, something really special about Lafayette, because I thought about this, because I don't know the number. I'd like to know if there's a number. The number of Europeans who fought in our revolution, right, was quite high. A lot of them came and went, and because
Right.
I think they immediately got here and they thought, I have to fight alongside these soldiers who are really farmers, right? These were seasoned professional soldiers who'd come from Europe, but the ones who stayed and who were successful, and Lafayette's the foremost among them, adapted to American customs, embraced the values of the revolution, and ingratiated themselves with the other revolutionaries. Of course, most prominently George Washington. That relationship is something that endears him to Americans all the way up to the point that we're about to talk about, 1824, and still today, his name is often mentioned in tandem with Washington. Adopted father Washington, as you know, had no actual biological children. Lafayette lost his father, still a very young child, so there was a bond there because of those two things.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned his father was killed at the Battle of Minden. His family is a product of the world. The 7 Years' War made, and that creates the possibility for the American Revolution, creates the possibility for the French Revolution. And as you say, there's all these guys who are coming over from Europe, interested in the idea that there's now a war that they can participate in the 1770s and 1780s, where they could win glory, where they could distinguish themselves in ways that they couldn't in Europe. Why do you think, as the conversation you had with Al, why was he able to grow into this role as a major general? Why is it that among the many French officers who come and think this is going to be my meal ticket to fame and glory, he's one of the only few that kind of sticks around for the longue durée?
I think part of it is his personality, which we see in the story of him coming back to America, is that there's an endless supply of optimism and enthusiasm about America. And you see it almost immediately when he gets here and he's writing home to his wife, Adrienne, saying, and you can contrast it with some of the other Frenchmen who came with him, who are saying its country's army is a bunch of ragamuffins, farmers who drink disgusting grog, and they even comment on the American women. And Lafayette gets here and immediately is writing home about the landscape is beautiful, the people are so simple and unpretentious. Of course, he doesn't say anything about he lands obviously in South Carolina. He doesn't say anything about slavery, but from the get-go, there's an incredible optimism and love for America. Again, I'm going to quote another friend. I don't want to. There's so much good material. I don't want to appropriate my friend Elizabeth Reese, who's also written a book about Lafayette's return. She said we were having a conversation, and she said he was America's golden retriever. Right? So no one, an incredible love for the country, I think, allowed him to the role we're talking about grow into it ideologically. But I think a real true enthusiasm for the rights of man. I mean, he spent the rest of his life with much, just gently say, varying degrees of success after the American Revolution, fighting to advance those, even on the eve of his departure for America in the summer of 1824, still on his mind. So I think it became a real passion for him, and that's one of the reasons why he was able to in part grow into that role off the battlefield.
I do like the idea of him being a golden retriever, because he did, it seems like, constantly crave affection, but not in an unnecessary way in many instances. Thinking about my own golden retriever who constantly wants attention, for sure. But, as you say, right, as he's thinking about the possibilities that he sees in the American Revolution, and he sees many possibilities, and some of which, as we'll talk later, remain unfulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
He, in between the time that he first arrives in the colonies in the late 70s and then returns in 1824, revolutionary fervor has really caught up with him in many and unexpected ways. What happens to Lafayette in those intervening years?
Well, he leaves at the end of 1781. Then he comes back after Treaty of Paris in 1784, in August 1784, and is here until December. He says goodbye to Washington for the last time, and goes home. And he's kind of a roving advocate for America, and then becomes the star of another revolution, famously, that I think he was prepared for because of his participation in our revolution. But I think it's Gouverneur Morris writes his education was incomplete in terms of revolution. An early starring role in the French Revolution, right? Leading the National Guard, writing an unused draft Declaration of Rights of Men, and then presiding over the Fête de la Fédération, right? Mm-hmm. The pledge to the new Constitution, which was being written at the time. And then it's interesting to me I was trying to make this comparison that when Lafayette comes back to America in 1824, he's kind of one of the reasons why he has this incredible effect of bringing the country together is he doesn't belong to any political party or any region or any section. I think there's some kind of analogy to why his downfall during the Revolution is that he did not have the sufficient trust of the radicals or of the royals. Both grew suspicious, and there's a massacre at the Champ de Mars, right? And he's forced to flee shortly after, and then famously the story that he heads for the Austrian Netherlands, which is today's Belgium, is arrested. At this point, France is at war with Austria and England, right, and is imprisoned for 5 years. Right. Eventually joined by his wife and daughters, and then when he's released from prison in 1797, immediately thinks about coming back to America and settling in Virginia, trying to find a home near Mount Vernon. But the political landscape of the United States has shifted so much because of the French Revolution that Washington has to gently tell him, should you return, you may not receive the welcome you expect, because Washington's neutrality, the war between France and England at this point, divides the nation up. It's already beginning to divide among factions, but only intensifies that. A whole series of quasi-war begins at this time, right? So as Washington points out to Lafayette, you can't come back here. And then Washington dies, right, at the end of 1799. So that dream is shot of being reunited with Washington. And Lafayette, for the up to the point that we're going to talk about, generally, his finances all his estates are seized during and after the Revolution. They're able to found a home, LaGrange, recovering some of Adrian's inheritance, and he tries to emulate Washington, gentleman farmer, retired from public life, and then other than briefly returning, during 100 days after helping convince Napoleon to abdicate after Waterloo, he's mostly quiet during this period, and then returns to public life. I think in 1818 is elected to the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house in the French Parliament. Then begins to work again to try and help recoup some of the advances made during the French Revolution. But even that goes sour eventually after numbers of former revolutionaries or radicals are elected to the chamber. The Bourbons say enough, and then he falls into what Albert Gallatin said after returning, who was the French minister up to, I think, 1823, and obviously before that, Secretary of the Treasury for Jefferson, for Madison too, I believe. During my time in Paris, Lafayette was insufferably involved in petty conspiracies. So he shifts his priorities from actual electoral politics to conspiracies, gets involved with the Carbonari, this Italian revolutionary cells trying to overthrow the French government. And so then eventually he totally misjudges it, which leads to a revolt against the liberals in France. And then he himself is drummed out of office at the beginning of 1824. So that's the political component. And on top of that, in the early 1820s, there's a series of revolutions in Europe, in Spain, in Portugal, in the Italian peninsula, that he invests a lot of hope in, seeing France at the center with all these other countries as a revolutionary movement spreading across the continent. But one by one, each of these revolutions are put down. So there's also the revolution in Greece too, that he's obviously heavily invested in. But he's at a political low point, and then also interestingly to me, he's at a personal low point again, having lost Adrian in 1807. He's a widower. His finances are a wreck. It was a wonderful thing just by complete chance here in Bloomington at the Lilly Library, they have some of the account books from LaGrange, including up to 1824. So we're able to look at those and see. I just say he's spending more money than he's taking in at this point. So he has considerable debts, and his health is in terrible shape too. He's regularly complaining about bouts of gout. So he's at a low point politically, personally, financially on the eve of his return to America.
One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I want to talk about sort of in the moment the memory that Americans have of Lafayette, but also Washington after he dies in 1799, and how that kind of shapes their memory of the Revolution. But one of the things that I thought was really fascinating in your book was the description you give of his home, LaGrange. He's turned it in kind of a museum of the American Revolution. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, take us through the gallery?
Well, there are numerous mementos of the Revolution itself, in terms of flags and weapons, and on top of that, then there are portraits of all his old friends. Washington, I think when he comes back from his journey, there's even more, right? But he's turned the one American visitor. Now, if you went to either Paris or LaGrange at this time and you were an American, you would have an audience with Lafayette. I like to say no American in France was a stranger to Lafayette. And there's great descriptions of Americans who visited LaGrange, seeing Lafayette and talking to Lafayette and hearing him say, I may not come back to America, but I have America here. I've recreated America here. And that's all his old friends, Washington, Franklin, others, portraits or busts. And he has, I was fascinated. He has various mementos or relics from Mount Vernon, right? I think he had one of Washington's umbrellas, and he had a piece of fabric knitted by Martha Washington. So he's created a museum, even though he thinks he may not be able to return to America. He's created this museum, and there's this wonderful vignette that his doctor records that. So Fayetteville, North Carolina, I believe, is the first location in America to be named for Lafayette. And the son of one of Lafayette's friends visits and then does a drawing of it and gives it as a gift to Lafayette. And there's a story about how Lafayette calls the artist in to, I think it's in his parlor, and says, I love this work of art that you've given me. I may never get to see it myself, but you've given me an idea of what it would look like. And so that's not quite a direct answer to your question, but I think that he'd surrounded himself in these memories of what was his reputation is built on his participation in our revolution. That's the most successful part of his life. And so I think he surrounded himself by memories of that as a way to keep himself happy in this period that we just discussed previously, of having suffered incredible storms in the French Revolution and the period afterwards, and then suffering financially and personally afterwards. It was a great comfort for him to be surrounded by memories of the American Revolution.
Yeah, it's a fascinating juxtaposition. As you say, right? There are these storms happening out with, but then internally in the house, he's created a kind of a space that reminds him of the possibilities of the good possibilities of revolution, and his roles in that in the latter part of the 18th century. As he's building out this kind of museum, memorial, monument to the American Revolution in his house, Americans are also becoming more aware that the revolutionary generation is passing. And again, one of the things I really took away from the book, and I'd like to pay you a compliment, because I think it's so hard to do, to actually give people a sense of what this meant to Americans at the time, what people like Washington and Lafayette meant to Americans at the time. We have a different relationship with them, because we're 250 years past them, but these are Americans who actually saw these guys. And the fact that Washington dies in 1799 and Lafayette is, still a well-known figure, and they talk about him in the newspapers, they're very weighty presence. Can you help us understand, like, what does that mean for American citizens in the beginning of the 19th century as this chapter begins to close and they're more self-aware that it's happening, how they come to grips with that.
I like what you said. It's harder for us to fathom this because we're so far from it, both in terms of chronology, but also our values have changed in a way that we don't look at the founders the same way that this generation would, for good and for bad, right? I was thinking about this, but in 1824, your neighbor could have been a veteran of the Revolution, your grandfather, your father. So there's an incredible proximity to it. It's one generation, right? It's one generation away. So I think it was ever present, but I just think that's a matter of math too, because in 1824, you're 2 years away from the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. And you have, just symbolically, you have 4 living signers of that document at the time, right? Adams, Jefferson, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and Charles Thompson. So, I mean, that's just, you have a generation that is slowly passing away. And it was interesting. You look in the newspapers, and every time a veteran dies, it's a big deal, right? Another hero gone. So there's a watch and a vigilance over it. So then the question would be, why? Is just a matter of passage of time and grieving over the loss of another generation. But I think, and there has been some historians have written about this, but I think it's also an anxiety accompanied by incredible progress. So the country has grown threefold, right, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, and you're in a time of incredible change and transformation. I think that's an important thing to drive home. Just steam-powered travels is a great example of that, how you're completely reducing distances of people and goods, and in an era where there's 600 newspapers now being circulated. So I think that there's a lot of angst about that, and there's questions about the compatibility of the acquisition of wealth with Republican virtues, because the second generation of Americans is now focusing increasingly on that. So there's a wrestling with all of these things. And then you have this presidential election, which has this great symbolism, because James Monroe, the end of his public life will mean that no other American who was of that generation will lead the country, because every other president up to that point had either been a soldier or a statesman. And the Revolution, and the 4 men who were seeking to replace Monroe, William Crawford, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, who did participate in the Revolution as a boy, but they're of another generation. So this symbolic transfer of the White House, to me, is also symbolic of generations turning. And I think it created an anxiety, which itself resulted in a reverence for the Revolution and kind of a nostalgia, and I say kind of a historic homesickness for that. So the territory, I feel like Lafayette didn't show up in a vacuum, and the country went crazy over one of my favorite quotes of all the letters that I looked at. Lafayette, when he's coming back from Boston in 1824, says, "Memories of the Revolution have come back to life." I thought it was so great. But I think they didn't just come back to life because of Lafayette. I think the country was already thinking about the Revolution at the time.
Yeah, they primed the pump in a lot of ways too. There was already a great deal of nonchalance of thinking about who had gone already and who was left. Lafayette's been thinking about coming back for years. Why 1824? What finally convinces him that this is the moment?
I think it's a build-up for a number of things. I think it's, what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation of his political fortunes. I think his American friends are watching with great concern, and amongst them the president, who is an old brother-in-arms, obviously. And there's some wonderful correspondence where, in the heat of Lafayette's political troubles, where a man named William Lee, who's one of Monroe's confidants, writes to Lafayette and says, "You will always have a home here. The president wants to know you will always have a home here. You will be safe here. You will be loved here." So I think there was a concern amongst those in positions of power about Lafayette's safety. I think his finances were generally known amongst his friends and also amongst the public. You see that when he actually gets to America. So there's a concern about his well-being. There's also on his part, there's an incredible, there's two different things. there are these wonderful letters between him and surviving veterans of the Revolution in the years leading up to him coming back. Tender, you know, nostalgic, and they usually conclude with an invitation and him saying, before my dying day, I will come back and I will embrace you again, and I will see the rest of our brother soldiers who remain, but I can't come now, because he was still committed to the fight for the rights of men in France. So there is an incredible desire to come back to see his old friends. I don't want to make it sound like there isn't a very emotional human part of the story, but the other part on his end is to come back to America. You alluded to this about surrounding himself with the potentials of revolution, of a successful revolution. There's a desire to come back to see that representative government can work, right? And then to transmit that back to Europe, to the monarchs of Europe, to say that man can govern himself and successfully. And he gets letters talking about things like the Erie Canal, which is coming online, it's going to be finished at the end of the fall of 1825. So there's these clues of what's happening in America that I think he assumes will verify that, in fact, that self-government can work. It can work beyond his wildest dreams. So there's a political propaganda aim to this tour. It's not just emotional. So the combination of the Americans having this nostalgia about him, being worried about him, I think also wanting him maybe to come and settle in the United States, and his desire to see his old friends, and also it's a way of advancing liberty back home in Europe by coming and reporting and then transmitting back to Europe the success of the revolution that he had participated in. And then, of course, that's an incredibly affirming thing, isn't it? That this project that I participated in all these years ago has worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams.
Well, as you say, right, by the time he comes back in 1824, there's more than 20 states. We're beyond the original 13. They're extending sovereignty and jurisdiction, not without consequences, of course, for indigenous people out to the Mississippi. There are steamships. There are the beginnings of railroads. There's this massive internal improvement project to connect Lake Erie to the Hudson. It was funny as I was reading. Of course, I read about this stuff before, but sometimes you just sort of forget, and then it surprises you, right? He's coming back to a world that is familiar, but it is in many ways fundamentally different. He's being invited too, I think, was the other really kind of fascinating thing. As you say, we've talked about the kind of nonchalance and the memory and the fading generations, but everybody's writing him. It's like, you must come. Monroe is, as you say, is sending him letters. People are sending letters. He's like, you've got to come. Be the nation's guest.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So what happens is these letters are some of them are reprinted in newspapers, spread widely across the country. So there's a sense amongst Americans that he wants to come. Mm-hmm. I think they ignore the part where he says, I can't come yet. But any indication that he wants to come. So rumors start in advance of him actually returning. And I loved it. There's editorialists in the newspapers that are sketching out romantically what it'll look like. And of course, the major set piece is him returning to Mount Vernon and the crypt there to visit Washington's grave. And editors are offering advice to the government, what the tour should look like and what the government should do for him. But in February of 1824, Congress does what Congress does. It takes note of the popular sentiment, and it passes resolutions of invitation attached with the offer of a national ship to bring him back. And it's funny, writing a book like this is enjoyable because you get to spend time with characters maybe who are well known, but you get to see them from a different perspective or a different part of their life. Like Lafayette, the Lafayette here, it's not a young soldier, it's an aging man wearing a wig and can't ride a horse anymore. But you also get to discover historical figures who you never encountered before. And one was James Brown, who's a senator from Louisiana, who Monroe nominated to be minister to France on the eve of Lafayette's visit. So he's responsible for actually taking the invitations to France and helping Lafayette get to America. So it's just one of these kind of subplots in the book. But so he's waiting in New York. His ship is postponed. And while he's waiting, Congress passes the resolution. So Monroe then sends Brown the resolution plus his letter to Lafayette of invitation. So now the thing is official. And then when Brown gets to France, he works with Lafayette to actually arrange for his departure to America.
When does he actually arrive?
He arrives in August of 1824. Fun little part of the story was he refuses the national ship, which of course there's some like symmetry with his original voyage to America in 1777. He buys his own ship, Victory, right, and comes to America. Well, now he says, I won't force the American people to pay my own way. But he can't pay for his own way now because he's so in debt. But almost every package ship that travels between the French coast and New York says, we've got a spot for you here. So a couple of them, I think he agrees for passage on a couple of them, but can't get his finances in order by the departure date for these ships. So he ends up going on a ship called the Cadmus. And Francis Allen, who is the captain, like so many of the other figures who Lafayette meets during this journey, his father was a veteran of the Revolution, and he, without consulting with the Whitlock family who owns the Cadmus, offers Lafayette passage, which means he has to get all the cargo that's on the ship off. So they end up losing thousands of dollars in the process. I like how he for years he's appealing to Congress to try and get the money back, and he writes at the time, and then later when he's testifying to Congress, he says, if the Congress was voting to invite Lafayette, it was an expression of the people's will, and I was just fulfilling that by offering Lafayette the ship, even though it cost the Whitlocks all this money.
It was like $4,000, if I recall.
Yeah.
Like that's not inexpensive in those days, for sure.
Yep.
I do want to talk about sort of specific spots along his travels, but can you just for a second kind of give us the big picture map of where he goes? Because it's enormous, the journey that he takes, and it's also not the most efficient in many ways.
When he's coming over on the Cadmus, he writes to some friends, I think he's writing to his daughters. He says the plan is New York and then to Boston. Boston's one of the first cities to extend its own invitation, then back down to New York, and then to begin the march towards the national capital, which, remember, didn't even exist the last time that he was here. And he'll stop and go through New Jersey, he'll stop in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then eventually get to Washington City, which isn't much of a city at the time. So that's the original itinerary, and I think he planned to go back to France in the spring of 1825. What ends up happening is that almost immediately he starts getting invitations from every state in the Union. This is just how important this was. It also shows you how quickly news was able to be transmitted. That he gets to New York in August, right in the middle of August. Incredible flotilla from Staten Island to Manhattan, where he's reunited with Richard Varick, Baroness Willett, Phil Van Cortlandt, all these old veterans of the Revolution. And then gets to Castle Garden, now Castle Clinton, and there's a procession up to City Hall. And women are waving their handkerchiefs, throwing them at him. Men are huzzahing, screaming. There's tears. Everyone's watching from a roof in a tree. And then men rush the carriage and try to unhook the horses so they can carry it themselves the rest of the way to City Hall. So it's like very early on in the story, you're getting a sense of the mania that is setting in. So he gets these invitations from the rest of the states. But the reason I wanted to mention that was that while this is happening in New York, often in Missouri, there's illuminations and bonfires upon receiving word that Lafayette had arrived thousands of miles away. And he's nowhere near being there, not guaranteed to ever show up. They're celebrating too, to give you a sense of the joy. So the invitations start coming in from the Carolinas, from the rest of the southern states, now the western states, not all of them, but most are extending invitations either to the fall of 1824 or early 1825. And he's resolved to visit all the states in the Union and begins in the fall of 1824, planning the southern wing of the tour. I think he originally had planned to try and go to the Carolinas at the end of the year in 1824, but was convinced that because of the turn in the weather, that it would be wise to wait out the winter and then go south in the spring. Well, while he winters in Washington, 1824, first months of 1825, where he's there for the presidential election when he gets thrown to the House of Representatives. His son, working with the postmaster, working with some government officials in Washington, and of course all the congressmen. If you're a congressman, you got to have them come to your district, obviously, right? That's like you'd be failing your constituents if you didn't do that. So there's all sorts of like debates. No, come this way, come through this. This is the best way to come through the Carolinas is this way. Another congressman or senator says, no, you got to go this way, always through their hometowns or through their districts. So his son helps plan this incredible second leg of the tour, which I call the voyage within the voyage, because it's really the most unprecedented part of this tour that will take him beginning at the end of February 1825 down through the Carolinas to Georgia to Savannah, and they swinging west across Georgia, Alabama, getting to New Orleans, and then going up the Mississippi, eventually getting to St. Louis and coming back down, and then catching the Cumberland, going to Nashville, catching the Ohio to Louisville. Then I have to mention this, coming across the Ohio to Indiana for a few hours, and then heading back east. Now this is the important thing you pointed out. It's not the most efficient tour. The important thing when we're discussing the second leg of the tour was that he had to be back east by June 17th, because when he's in Boston in August of 1824, he visits Bunker Hill. And there's some locals are planning a potential monument on the site. There's no concrete plans yet, but on the 50th anniversary of the battle, there's going to be some type of ceremony. And they say to him, if you're here next summer, could you participate? This is before he's confirmed to even be in the country. And he says, if I am, I will. So when New Year comes around and it's clear he will be here, when he's about to embark on this tour of the southern and western states, the one condition is I have to be in Boston by the 17th. So you got to travel. Think about thousands and thousands of miles, and also think of the traveling conditions. You're riding stagecoaches through forests, steamboats on dangerous rivers, barges, right? And you got to all do it in like 4 months. And you got to stop in as many places as possible to shake as many hands as possible, to hold as many babies as possible, to participate in as many civic ceremonies and hear as many speeches as possible. So it's this incredible tour of this parts of America. When he gets to Alabama, it's the first state that he'll visited that wasn't part of the Union.
When he's 66 years old at this point?
Yeah, 67. Yeah.
67, right? So he's 67, he's walking with a cane, he can't ride a horse anymore.
Right.
That's not easy for a younger man, let alone, somebody of his age. But as you say in the book, it makes clear from the evidence, and he himself says it kind of rejuvenates him as he's taking the tour. And who's he sharing this tour with? Who's coming with him?
He brings his son, his loyal son, middle-aged son, George Washington Lafayette, who, as you know, lived at Mount Vernon for a period of time and was kind of an adopted son or grandson of George Washington. He brings along his valet, Sebastian Bastian Wagner, and then a newer friend, a young soldier who's been drummed out of the service recently, whose name is Auguste Levasseur, who he hires as a secretary to help with correspondence, I think with speeches, but also to record the journey. And he does so in a number of letters he sends back to George Washington Lafayette's wife that recount the visit. And those form, in large part, he published diaries or journal of the visit, which is like the primary source for this event. But I was able to look at some of those letters. I hired a translator, and we went through them. And there's some stuff in there that isn't in the journal. The journals are obviously very pro the United States for obvious reasons. And some of the letters have some more unvarnished observations and more wit, a little more sardonic humor in them. So that's the core group that's traveling. There's some other, they very rarely travel alone as a unit because there's always some, I think at some point, just to demonstrate, there's always some representative of the city he's leaving or the place he's going to that wants to be with him wherever he's traveling. But I think at some point when they are traveling up to St. Louis, the original itinerary of the Western Southern tour got altered a little bit from what was published in the papers to where they actually went when they were there. And when they get to the mouth of the Ohio, they were greeted by a delegation from Tennessee on another steamboat, and they think, oh, you're going to come to Nashville now. And they say, no, we're actually going to St. Louis now. So there's this like, no, you got to come to Tennessee. And so there's already delegations from Mississippi and Louisiana on board. So they say, no, we're going to St. Louis, but you can come with us, and then we'll come back down and we'll stop in Illinois. So at some point, I think he's got like Mississippi, Missouri, Tennessee, Illinois. He's got delegations from all these different states joining him. So that was the core group, but they were almost always with American friends wherever they went.
One of the really funny things I noticed, I think it was Levasseur, who the secretary is noting differences between European and American culture. And there's a moment where John Quincy Adams joins them on part of the journey on a steamboat, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
John Quincy Adams is quite the distinguished figure, Secretary of State and, minister for many years under many different administrations. And so pretty prominent figure in the United States, at least, politically, and certainly the son of a former president.
Mm-hmm.
And they are kind of flabbergasted that he is willing to just lay in a common bed in a room with, Lafayette and his Rentoon and other people, as opposed to essentially taking a stateroom and as something they would think is befitting a former minister of state. And so there's like a lot of those little nuggets in the book. And one of the things we were musing about before we hit record was there are things that you found, observations that people made, these little nuggets here and there as you were piecing this story together about people seeing Lafayette and how they kind of created a portrait of the nonchalant, the memory, the enthusiasm that we've seen. Can you tell us a little bit about who some of these folks are, and people that sometimes they're actually quite famous. There's a few quite famous people that showed up that I had not expected, and then there's just kind of regular, ordinary Americans who are watching Lafayette pass through. What sense are they making of all of this?
When I was doing research, actually here at the Lilly Library, just like I said, just incredible fortune of having a vast collection of Lafayette manuscripts a couple miles from where I live, and not knowing that at the beginning of the process, honestly. I was looking through letters written by Lafayette, by George Washington Lafayette, by Monroe, others, names we know, right? And I found a letter by a woman named Annie Finch. I think it's from Albany or Buffalo. It was about 4 pages long. And I was determined to find Lafayette's impressions of being here, what he was feeling and seeing. And also trying to piece together the kind of mechanics of this tour, like we talked a little bit about, how we got the boat. So I wasn't, when I saw this letter and I saw the name I didn't recognize, I was trying to move fast, right? You only have a limited amount of hours before a library closes. But I decided, I looked at it and then I thought, I'm better read this. And it was her recollections of being in New York on September 6th, which is Lafayette's birthday. It was a big celebration at Washington Hall, which was on Broadway, by the Society of Cincinnati for Lafayette. And she records, first of all, there's kind of like the actual storytelling. She sneaks in with no invitation, and she and some of her friends sneak in with no invitation, determined, I have to see him. If I'm ever going to see him, this is my chance. So she gets in, and the guards immediately come and say, out, ladies, get out. And then old Baroness Willett, who's Lafayette had fought alongside at Battle of Monmouth, had corresponded with, who was actually a veteran of the French and Indian Wars, and then a member of the Sons of Liberty in New York. Really interesting guy. I think he was mayor of New York, a close friend of Aaron Burr's. He shows up. He hobbles into the room and he says, oh, let the ladies stay. She records all of this. And then next thing you know, in comes Lafayette. So she records, I can't believe it was my good fortune to see the companion of Washington. So that was incredibly moving to me. And it brought home what was happening in a way that none of the correspondence or recollections of the people whose names we know quite did. I think for obvious reasons. Because they knew him, they were in different positions, right? That maybe didn't mean as much to them. But then beyond that, she then goes off into this digression about the whole country's lost their minds. Observing that everyone has just gone silly with Lafayette mania, Lafayette this, Lafayette that. And then from there, she begins to wrestle with it. But if there was ever a moment for us to lose our minds, this is it, in gratitude to Lafayette. But that one, so I read that and I thought, this drives home the importance of the event, number one. Because, I've read about this in great biographies of Lafayette and histories of the period. It's usually a chapter. And you get a sense of the spectacle, and you get a sense of the importance to the nation of this event. But I wanted to try and essay it. It's a challenge to try and stretch it out beyond a couple of chapters. And I wanted to get a sense of what people were feeling, not just what John Quincy Adams or James Monroe or Andrew Jackson was feeling, but what people who you and I, whose names we've never heard or otherwise would hear of, what they were feeling. So then when I read that, and the Lilly Library had numerous other firsthand accounts like that, I started to think that's the way to tell the story. The best way to convey to readers why this was important and what Americans were feeling was through these I would just say everyday Americans, right? And for me, the one that summarizes what this event meant was written by a woman named Elizabeth Crosby, who was in Boston. And she wrote a letter where it's actually quite stoic. She describes herself as stoic, where she says, this is all quite silly. She's watching a procession from Roxbury to the Common, and there's, one account says thousands of school children waiting for him in Boston, and one young girl steps forward and is lifted up and hands him a wreath to put around his head, a halo. And she says, it's just too much, right? And is it compatible with our values? And then she goes into this, she says, well, that may be so, but how can you look at the old veteran of the Revolution? And how can you look at all the old veterans of the Revolution? How can you look at their widows and not feel something pulling at your heart? Right? How can you not feel grateful in your heart? So I was amazed that, the Americans were thinking about this. They were closer to the Revolution. We talked about that at the beginning of our conversation. So they were closer to the values of the Revolution. And they were wrestling about whether this celebration was compatible. And then they were coming down on the side of, remember, this nostalgia that we talked about, the Revolution being on people's minds of, yes, for this moment, it's okay. It's worth it. It's deserved. And that was fascinating to me.
Well, one of those moments is only a few days after the Washington Hall meeting, where there is a spectacular ball, I think is the only way to describe it, at Castle Garden in New York in September 14th, if I remember correctly. Just the descriptions of a party I don't think I've ever really read about before in early America. But it also speaks to, and I'd like you to think a little bit about this too, but it also speaks to the kind of changed nature, the uncomfortability Americans are having with this idea of a kind of flattening democracy and equality, but also it's indicative of class tensions in society as well, where there is this grand ball, but there is some exclusivity to it. Tell us a little bit about the grandeur of that and the kind of people who are attending it.
The planners, it's a in cooperation with the city of New York, private committees are planning what they describe. I think, if they did not state this verbatim in any of the planning minutes or their appeals, to use Castle Garden, which was at this point was a fortification built during the War of 1812 to defend the city, which then kind of is purposeless and is in a space that can be rented for events. I think they aim to plan the greatest celebration, outdoor celebration in the history of, if not America, of history. I mean, it just shows you this kind of mania, the fervor that's set in, which is about Lafayette, but it's also about the idea of, there's an incredible amount of, I love to say this, I think that Americans, one of the reasons they were so excited by Lafayette's visit was they caught their reflection in his eye of a rising republic, wealthy, advanced in industry, and in this case, arts. They had a whole battalion of architects and artists, sailors are hired to retrofit this fortification for this incredible, elaborate celebration, which has columns. They install columns and balconies and pyramid for Lafayette, and of course everywhere Washington's image and flags of the states and Hamilton's image, and then there's the build on top. It's interesting. This is like you have to forgive me for making this comparison, or maybe you like it, but I think it resonates with people when I start talking about the Eras tour, in the sense that like obviously it's a sensation, but it was I was reading, was it last summer or whenever that was, it was actually like impacting the economy of local places, right? Who people were rushing to rent hotel rooms and to go into restaurants. So it's like build on economic effect. It's happening. That is happening in New York, because if you look at the newspapers during this time, you're talking about who's going to be allowed, who's going to participate. Well, who's going to be able to actually afford a ticket, right? But then you can't go to the great ball at Castle Garden without having your Lafayette sash, your Lafayette watch chain, your Lafayette hat, right?
Merch.
So there's all this swag, Lafayette swag. There's a great editorial in one of the New York newspapers at this time saying we have Lafayette peaches and Lafayette pears, Lafayette barbers, Lafayette oxes. It's quite amusing in what ways our countrymen and women contrive to take our money from us. So you see this burst of capitalistic fervor surrounding, particularly about the Castle Garden. So it becomes, yeah, you're right. It becomes an event for, if you have the means to participate in this, you're there, you get to see him, you're dancing when he comes in late at night. And I mean, all the kind of eyewitness in the newspapers and various people who were there who recorded it say, just stunned. They never seen anything like it in terms of the scope, the elaborate decorations, the food. I think there's a huge cake decorated with sugar plums with Lafayette's name inscribed all over it. What's interesting, though, amongst all this is that Levasseur, in his correspondence, describes being a little bit depressed by the whole thing, thinking it's almost too much that he and George Washington Lafayette wanted to hide in a corner. Now, I think Lafayette himself probably loved it, because obviously he alluded to, I mean, Jefferson said canine appetite for popularity. Well, he's at the center of the grandest ball in the history of the United States, but it's just one example. It's a bit of an excessive example, but I tied into this idea on a positive side. When he's in New York in September of 1824, he's seeing the fact that the United States could stage this, actually putting together this in terms of the decorations, is evidence of growth of, like I said, of industry and in the arts. And that's something he takes incredible satisfaction in. And when he comes back, he's at this party, he leaves like 3 a.m, 2 a.m, and his party go up the Hudson all the way to Albany and then across to Troy, where he actually sees the canal for the first time. And then he goes to Emma Willard's female seminary in Troy. When he comes back down, he writes to a fellow French veteran of the Revolution. He says, you cannot believe the miracle made possible here by self-government and instruction and liberty. It surpasses my imagination, I know.
One of the people who arrived just in time for the Castle Garden Ball is a woman named Fanny Wright. Fascinating figure. She has a very complicated relationship with Lafayette, much to the chagrin of his family sometimes, it seems. Who was Fanny?
Fanny was if you squint a little bit, was a Scottish female version of Lafayette. They were even born on the same birthday, decades apart, obviously. Like him, she was orphaned, inherited a fortune, and one of her greatest passions in life was America. She was a person who I think we would say now had many noble beliefs, such as equality of races and gender, a loathing for slavery, much like Lafayette. I think that her fervor in those beliefs probably precluded her the ability to modulate those views and to strike the necessary compromises and achieve the necessary diplomacy to actually affect them in any way at this point in both history of Europe and America. So I think that was probably her ultimate downfall. But she's someone who is introduced to Lafayette in the years before, I think in 1821, and she travels from Scotland to France, and they meet. She actually comes to Paris, can't find him, then travels out to, well, she travels out to Lagrange and he's not there, and then goes back to Paris where they actually meet. Now, she'd already been to America previously and written a book. It was a publication of her letters, her observations of American customs, values, and culture. So her and Lafayette immediately have this connection of their interest in America and form this very intense relationship. He's her mentor, she's a protege. I mean, I don't think any other historians have ever actually advanced the idea that there was a romantic nature to the relationship, but they were strangely intimate. They were incredibly intimate. Their correspondence bears this out. The way they referred to each other, my friend until death, my beloved father. She saw him as a father figure. He referred to her and her sister Camilla as his adopted daughters. She, like him, obviously was a great advocate for the rights of men and women. And she, obviously, I think she, in her mind, when Lafayette determines that he's going to come back to America, in her mind, she would be there with him. Only natural, given her own relationship to the United States. Her intimacy with Lafayette grated on his children, who found her. I think you can read a little bit about her personality. Again, I think one of her, like I said, a woman of incredibly noble beliefs, but I think no tact and probably not a lot of self-awareness. I think that her increasing, in her eyes, her importance in Lafayette's life upset his children and they begin to resent. And then there was innuendo that there was more to the relationship than just mentor and mentee. So his children were eager to reach some type of separation between her and Lafayette. So she was originally, her and her sister were at Lagrange quite frequently after their beginning of the relationship. She's there less and less in the months leading up to his departure. She threatens to break off the friendship. She goes back to Scotland. He then falls into a fit of despair. He's actually apparently physically becomes ill because of the potential of their friendship disintegrating. So the Lafayette's children eventually have to kind of reconcile this. So they work out an agreement where she will come with him to America, but she'll just leave later, and then she'll travel at a distance. So in terms of perceptions, that doesn't look like he's traveling with this young woman. So I have seen it written that she both then and then later that Fanny Wright traveled with, or that she followed Lafayette in the United States. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think Fanny Wright is a woman that followed anyone.
Right.
So she came to America because Lafayette, in Lafayette's wake. But what ends up happening, it's an interesting part of the story. It's a story in itself, and others have written it with much more detail than I have, is that she comes to America. She, like you alluded to, she gets here right in time for the event at Castle Garden. In fact, her sister claims that Lafayette told them that, because the event was delayed for a couple of days because of rain, but her sister claims in correspondence that Lafayette told them that he delayed it purposely so they could be there for it, which doesn't seem likely. But they get to New York, then they travel with him part of the way up the Hudson, then they separate, and then they are reunited. They rendezvous in Philadelphia, and then they separate again. And it's very important for Lafayette that she is at Monticello when he visits in November, when he spends time with Jefferson. He had sent Jefferson copies of her books. She had corresponded with Jefferson. He admired her work. So it was very important to make that introduction. Of course, if you're Fanny Wright, you're a young lover of America, you think America is the world's best last hope, of course you want to have an audience with Thomas Jefferson. And on her way to Virginia, what she ends up seeing is she sees men and women manacled on a steamboat, I think in Norfolk. She hadn't seen that previously. And that's the end. I just say the idea of her just being there to travel in Lafayette's wake, to participate in these events, that's the end. And she immediately starts to say there's an incredible hypocrisy to celebrate Lafayette, this champion of liberty, when the rights of human beings are denied in this country. And from that moment on, for the rest of Lafayette's trip and then beyond, when he returns to France, she remains. Her primary goal is to find a solution to end slavery in America. It's not to follow Lafayette around, and their paths begin to diverge at that point.
We'll come to the meeting at Monticello here in a few moments as we as we work our way through the tour, because it is a formative moment for both Lafayette, for Jefferson, and for Fanny Wright, and what they're thinking about in terms of the future of the Republic. As they're doing so, as they're making this tour, they're also traveling through the United States in the middle of a really contentious. I mean, when aren't presidential elections contentious anymore, right? But particularly contentious for the reasons you kind of articulated earlier. It is the first election where there isn't somebody up for the presidency who was not a real direct participant. Andrew Jackson was at the Battle of Waxhaws in 1780, of course, but John Quincy Adams watched the Battle of Bunker Hill, for goodness sakes. But nobody of a Jefferson or an Adams or a Washington or a Monroe or a Madison, those lights are fading. But it's also a kind of a contest about the future of the Republic. Lafayette's aware of this. How does he try to navigate this, as Washington, as his adopted father might say, this Scylla and Charybdis, right?
So it's a weird election, but then again, when are presidential elections not weird? It's a four-candidate, one-party election, because at this point, the Federalists had really ceased to be a player at the presidential level, and the party will be extinct by the end of the decade. So there's been an amalgamation of the parties, the Federalists, Democrat, Republicans, and with them, some Federalist ideas and policies are now part of this larger. The party of Jefferson has now expanded to have very non-Jeffersonian ideas, so like the kind of infrastructure, the American improvements that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. So you have Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, these four men. Actually, it's actually five, because John C. Calhoun is in the election right at the beginning and then eventually drops out to seek the vice presidency. So it's a very strange election. And I don't know that the candidates John Quincy Adams wanted to be the national candidate, for example, because he had been a Federalist and then he ended up becoming kind of a Democrat Republican. So he thought he would be a national candidate. But because of these tensions about economic downturn in 1819 and the sectional crisis about Missouri coming into the Union, have fired all these regional antagonisms. The Western states want a Western president. The Northern states don't want a Southern president. The Virginians already had the president enough. The Southern states don't trust a Northerner, especially about the issue of slavery. So, and this is all litigated in these, I've mentioned 600 newspapers, all these partisan newspapers are firing up these incredible antagonisms. And there's also new unconventional means of electioneering. And then on top of that, I like to think of this election as the dawn of the Jacksonian era. It's not the beginning necessarily, but it's the prelude when democracy gets closer to the people, right? When kind of the institutional barriers between the people and democracy start being sheared a little bit. And you start seeing a more direct election of president by the people instead of state legislatures at this time. So it's a very unique election, kind of transformative interlude before the Jacksonian era. And there's a lot of worry that this type of election is going to destroy the Union. You see numerous commentators in all regions saying, we don't think that the Union can withstand these tensions or an election of this nature. So Lafayette arrives in the middle of all this. And those wonderful correspondence I found, a man named George Irving, who was had formerly been ambassador to Spain, is in Paris in the summer of 1824 before Lafayette departs, and he's a Crawford partisan. And he's writing to Crawford, and he writes to Monroe, and he's saying, if Lafayette comes back, basically, and is seen with Jackson, it confers this sense, first of all, the sense of the kind of this nostalgic revolutionary feeling. And as you mentioned, Jackson's supporters claim that he is of the revolution. The Wyoming papers, like John Eaton says, don't forget, he is of the revolution because it's the defense of the Waxhaws, right? So Irving is saying, if Lafayette comes and he's seen handing, Washington's spyglass to Jackson, this is going to be really bad for Crawford. So he goes to Monroe and he says, he can't come now. He goes to the America's Minister to France, James Brown, and says, please, not now, not now. Then he goes to Lafayette and says, if you come back to the United States right now in the middle of this election where the parties are already at war, you're going to make things worse. Lafayette's response, according to Irving, was, I will not do that. I will come to America and I will take no side. I will have no involvement in the presidential election. And I will, above all else, stress the importance of union to the American people. So that is the design of his relationship with this presidential election. He stays out of it. He is friends with each of the four men. He'd never met Jackson before. He had relationships with the other three, but he visits. We can chronicle, I think it's in the book, we can chronicle his interactions with all four of those men at various times and his friendships with all four of those men. In his own correspondence, I think with some exaggeration, he says, when he's writing to his daughters, he says, "We know nothing of the presidential contest." It's someone who's that interested in politics and involved in politics, probably, I don't know if that's true. And he writes a letter to Jefferson, because obviously what ends up happening is, no one wins the requisite electoral count, which was expected with four candidates, and the election is thrown to the House, where the three top electoral vote earners, Crawford, Jackson, and Adams, end up standing for the election in the House. So the partisan fires are lit again at that point. And, there's Adams receives death threats. According to Lavasseur, some of Jackson's supporters threaten to storm the Capitol if Jackson doesn't win. But all through that period, and the newspapers begin to worry, they describe a coming crisis, Lafayette is writing to friends and to his family and saying, "I'm not worried. The Europeans are going to see how this representative democracy works and how leadership will be passed from the revolutionary to the second generation of Americans." And that's what ends up happening, is that when Adams wins in the House, the crowds disperse from the Capitol peacefully. And that night at the White House, Jackson walks up to Adams and extends his hand. So he stays out of it. But the observation, which I think is really interesting, that Lafayette himself makes, and Jefferson makes too, not an unpartisan figure, obviously, right? Over and over again is that, and the newspapers say this as well, and part of the reason for this, that we'll get to, is because the newspapers became less interested in the presidential election and more interested in Lafayette's return. Over and over again, Lafayette is saying, Americans who had not sat together at the table for 20 years because of political divisions are doing so now, because of memories of the revolution. And Jefferson is saying as well, Lafayette's return has reminded us that we are one people and of the importance of union. So what I think is that what happened is that it was a distraction. The newspapers were full of wonderful descriptions of Lafayette's return and less fulminating editorials about the aristocratic John Quincy Adams or the dangerous Andrew Jackson or the sick William Crawford, because he likely had a stroke for the election. And instead they're talking about this wonderful return of the memories of the revolution. And it brought the American people, I'd say, together, or it prioritized common myth and common memory and history over partisanship. It didn't mean that Americans gave up their disagreements, but I think for a time they put them on pause and they joined together in this great celebration.
When Lafayette goes to Mount Vernon to do a pilgrimage that so many Americans are doing in the early 19th century, to the crypt that overlooked the Potomac, the old crypt before the new one was built in the 1830s, is he aware that, of course he wants to go see where his adopted father is resting, but is he also sort of self-conscious that by making that pilgrimage, he's contributing to that idea of unity in this fractious moment?
I think so. I can't document that. I can't document it, but I think naturally, because you know why? Because it's a very real thing, by the way. It's not a performative thing for him to go to Mount Vernon and visit the crypt. But there is, obviously, for someone who's so keenly aware of symbolism and imagery, obviously there is part of that involved. That is a genuine, when he emerges from the crypt with tears streaming down his face, a later recollection was that he cried like a baby, right? A man who was a slave at Mount Vernon at the time, many, many years later, said that was his observation. I think it's very real, but I think, yes, to answer your question, I think he was aware of the value of that image of Lafayette, the pilgrimage to Mount Vernon at the time, because I think it was the great set piece, more so than Castle Garden, actually, or the procession into Philadelphia. I think it was a great set piece of the whole trip, the one that newspapers reported about, that poets composed odes they were inspired by. So yeah, I think it was this incredible, powerful moment. The symbolism was not lost on Lafayette.
There are many more aspects of the trip that we could talk about, but I want to move us a little bit further west to the mountaintop of Monticello. He's at Mount Vernon. That's a kind of very kind of public spectacle in a lot of ways. People are watching it. And as you say, an enslaved man witnesses Lafayette crying. Lafayette would have seen the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. He gets to Monticello. He sees the same thing. And Fanny Wright comes and they're talking about the future of America. What what sense has Lafayette made by this point in his trip? And the trip's not over by a long shot at this point, but he's there for about 10 days at Monticello.
Hmm.
Affords him a little bit of privacy from a very hectic schedule, and he and Jefferson are talking about the future. What does the future look like for Lafayette in the United States?
Well, I like to talk about this in kind of there's a duality here about. So he's having these conversations, and we know we're pretty sure he had them because there are recollections from one of Jefferson's former slaves about conversations had in the carriage many years later, obviously. And some of Fanny Wright's correspondence is pretty clear when she was there that she was talking to Jefferson about solutions. And there's some correspondence between Lafayette and Jefferson, I believe, in January of 1825. So after they had visited, about you can trace that they had been talking about solutions, which Jefferson did not have any, which is not to diminish his accomplishments at all. But he and Madison, for all their brilliance, weren't able at this late state in their lives to rouse the energy to find solutions. They usually were, the idea that freed slaves would be relocated to Western Africa, right? Um, and then Levasseur actually does say in his journals that one of the primary subjects of conversation at Montpelier was slavery as well. So I digressed, but to come back to your question, what I am interested in, fascinated by, is that I mentioned before when we were talking about the great ball at Castle Garden, how when Lafayette comes back from his trip up the Hudson, he's saying, the progress in America surpasses my imagination. He says that numerous times when he's traveling up the Mississippi. He says it again. You can't imagine the industry and the arts, everything made possible here because of representative government and because of the wisdom of these people, over and over again. And it's not just, there's interesting, there's elements of what we describe as civil society that has grown in America that Lafayette is getting to see. He's going to hospitals and charities, and then he's going to museums. And in Louisville, he's taking in the theater and the circus, right? Even in the Western states, he's seeing all this incredible growth and advancement. And he's incredibly happy about it. And part of it is because he's happy because he can say, I have some authorship over it, obviously. Mm-hmm. He's able to see that and be overjoyed and tell his friends this. But he's obviously heartsick about seeing slavery. Obviously, in the southern states, slavery was not outlawed in New York even at this time. It was sunsetted, but not outlawed. And then what he describes, I think, very gently as the relationship between the races. So obviously, incredible racism and inequality. So he's upset about this incredibly. What he does is that in numerous places on the story, he does these kind of very, very symbolic meetings and gestures. When he's in Manhattan, he goes to the free school for black children, for example. When he's in the southern states, he meets. I think this is really interesting. The choreography. The way I wrote it was when he gets into South Carolina and then to Georgia, he's kind of becoming the memorializer of the revolution. He presides over the cornerstone laying of monuments to DeKalb, Blaski, and Greene. When he's in Savannah, and remember, the newspapers print ads, the city warning, no slaves anywhere near these celebrations. He's meeting, and I think in Columbia too, he's meeting with black men who had participated in the revolution. So it's like he's also indicating during the swing of the tour, it wasn't just DeKalb, Pulaski, and Greene, but also, obviously, numerous black soldiers fought in the American Revolution, right?
Right.
When he's in New Orleans, he specifically requests to meet with one of these battalions of free black men who had participated in the defense of the city in 1815 with Andrew Jackson, which had been disbanded because citizens of New Orleans were not comfortable with the battalion of free black men. And they're brought back together to meet with Lafayette in public, because it's all recorded in the newspapers. And then my favorite one of these is that when so we're kind of jumping ahead in the trajectory, but when he gets to Cincinnati, the original plan was to go overland in Ohio, but because of time trying to get back to Boston, by the 17th, they end up taking a steamboat up the Ohio and stopping at a number of these river towns. And one of them is Gallipolis, right, which was founded by French expatriates. And he has a conversation that is reported in the local newspapers where he's telling them is that you are so lucky to live on this side of the Ohio River, where this is his words, where slavery cannot breathe. These are things that are said obviously for public consumption. So to me, he's saying to America, your future is incredibly bright. The world is better off because of America. America is great, but America still has great work to do. And I think now I'm adding my own words, but I think you could have also added, you have the tools to commence that work because of the revolution.
And I think that's actually a really excellent way to end it, because that's a message of there's still work to be done.
That's kind of the history, not just of Lafayette's visit, but of our country and our revolution. It's ongoing. That's a wonderful way to kind of move forward to next year, 250th.
Well, Ryan, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been a terrific conversation. I love the book. I'm going to recommend it to all my friends and to all of our listeners. So when you've got another one, come back and see us.
I promise I will.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for joining us on Revolutions in Retrospect. I'm Dr. Jim Ambuske, your host for this episode. Thanks to our producers, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, Patrick Long, and Jeanette Patrick. Please share the show on social media and help other listeners find it by rating and reviewing on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Revolutions in Retrospect is a joint production between Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media.